The moment Marcus Wade accepted her as payment, he had no idea his entire world was about to change forever. It was the kind of mistake that could cost a man everything in the untamed territories of the West. And yet, it would become the greatest decision of his life. Marcus had been riding for 3 days straight. His cattle lost to a flash flood that tore through the canyon like the hand of God himself. His supplies down to nothing but hardtack and dried jerky, and his prospects even bleaker than the desert sun beating down on his weathered face. He was desperate. The kind of desperate that makes good men consider bad choices, and bad men consider worse ones. When he rode up to the trading post run by a man named Thornton, Marcus knew he was at the end of his rope. He needed food, blankets, ammunition, but his pockets held nothing but dust and broken promises. Thornton was the kind of man who saw opportunity in other people's suffering, his eyes calculating, his smile never quite reaching the coldness behind his gaze. He looked at Marcus the way a vulture looks at something dying in the heat. Marcus explained his situation with what little pride he had left. He offered to work off the debt, to come back with payment when he could, anything to get what he needed to survive another month in this unforgiving land. But Thornton, he just laughed. That dry, crackling laugh that sounded like bones rattling in a wooden box. And then he made his offer. There was a young woman, an Apache, standing in the corner of that dim trading post, her hands bound with rough rope, her dress torn and dusty, but her eyes held something that made Marcus's stomach turn with shame for even being in that place. Pride. That's what her eyes held. Fierce and unbroken despite everything. Thornton said he'd won her in a card game from some drifters who'd taken her during a raid. Said she was good for labor, for cooking and mending. Said she was worth more than the supplies Marcus needed. But he was feeling generous that day. Marcus felt the weight of that moment pressing down on him like the sky itself was falling. He knew what he was being asked to accept. Knew that taking her would make him complicit in something his mother would have wept to see, something his father would have beaten him for considering. But survival. Survival doesn't care about morality when you're 3 days from dying of thirst or starvation in the desert. He looked at her again, really looked at her. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23 years old. Her black hair hung in tangles past her shoulders, her skin dark from the sun and marked with bruises that told stories Marcus didn't want to imagine. And yet she stood there with her chin raised, with defiance radiating from every inch of her small frame, as if she was the one in control, as if she was merely tolerating their presence rather than being their prisoner. Marcus made his choice. God help him, he made his choice. He took the supplies, and he took her, telling himself he'd set her free once they were away from Thornton, telling himself he was actually saving her from a worse fate, telling himself all the lies that men tell themselves when they compromise who they thought they were. They rode out as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and red that looked like the whole world was on fire, and neither of them spoke a single word. Marcus led his horse with her sitting behind him on the saddle, her hands still bound, her body rigid with tension, and with every mile they traveled, the weight of what he'd done grew heavier on his conscience. He'd accepted a human being as payment, like she was livestock, like she was property, and no amount of justification could wash away that stain. As darkness fell and he made camp in a small canyon that offered some shelter from the wind, Marcus finally worked up the courage to speak, to at least tell her his name, to try and explain that he meant to let her go. But when he turned to face her, when he looked into those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through all his excuses and rationalizations, the words died in his throat, because in that moment, Marcus Wade realized he wasn't dealing with some broken victim, some helpless captive who would be grateful for his mercy. He was dealing with someone who had already decided his fate, someone who was measuring him, judging him, and finding him wanting. Her name was Kai, though he wouldn't learn that until much later. And she was about to teach this cowboy more about honor and strength than he'd learned in all his years on the frontier. The first night they camped together was the longest of Marcus's life, filled with silence that spoke louder than any words, and the dawning realization that he'd stumbled into something far more complicated than a simple exchange of goods. He'd stumbled into a story that would define the rest of his days. A story that started with shame and desperation, but would grow into something he never could have imagined. And it all began with that one terrible choice: accepting her as payment, treating a human soul like it could be bought and sold, and then having to live with what that said about who he really was. The next morning arrived cold and unforgiving. Just like the reality Marcus now faced, he'd cut the ropes from Kai's wrists while she slept. Or at least while she pretended to sleep. He couldn't really tell which. And he'd laid out some food and water within her reach, hoping these small gestures might communicate what his words apparently couldn't. But when dawn broke across the canyon walls, when that first light spilled over the rocks like liquid gold, Kai simply stood up, brushed the dust from her torn dress, and began walking south, not running, not fleeing, just walking, with purpose and direction. As if she knew exactly where she was going and nothing was going to stop her. Marcus called out to her, told her to wait, told her she was free to go wherever she wanted, but that direction led straight into the harshest part of the desert, the part where even experienced travelers died of thirst before finding water. She didn't even turn around, so Marcus did the only thing that made sense in that moment, the only thing his conscience would allow. He packed up his meager supplies, saddled his horse, and followed her. For hours they traveled like that, her walking ahead with steady, measured steps, him trailing behind on horseback, feeling more and more like a fool with each passing mile. The sun climbed higher, turning the air into something that felt like breathing fire. And still she walked, never slowing, never showing signs of the exhaustion that must have been tearing through her body. Marcus offered her water 3 times. She refused. He offered to let her ride the horse. She refused. He tried to explain again that he intended to help her return to her people. And she finally stopped walking. She turned to face him. And for the first time since leaving Thornton's trading post, she spoke. Her words were in Apache, low and steady and filled with something that sounded like both warning and wisdom. And though Marcus couldn't understand the language, he understood the meaning perfectly clear. She didn't trust him, didn't want his help, and certainly didn't believe his promises about setting her free or taking her home. Why would she? After all, he'd accepted her as payment. They continued on, and as the day stretched into afternoon, Marcus began to notice something that chilled him, despite the oppressive heat. Kai wasn't just walking randomly south. She was following something. Reading the land in ways he couldn't, adjusting her path based on signs he didn't understand. Marks in the sand, the way certain plants grew, the flight patterns of birds overhead. She knew this desert, knew it intimately, and suddenly Marcus understood that she wasn't lost at all. She was going home. By evening they reached a rocky outcropping where a tiny spring bubbled up from between ancient stones, barely more than a trickle. But Kai had led them directly to it, as if following a map only she could see. She knelt down and drank, and Marcus dismounted and did the same. And in that moment of shared necessity, of both being creatures who needed water to survive, something shifted between them, not trust, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. That night, Marcus made camp near the spring, and this time when he laid out food, Kai took some. Not with gratitude, but with the practical acknowledgement that she needed fuel for the journey ahead. He tried again to communicate, using gestures and the few words he'd picked up from trading with Apache in the past. Words like friend, peace, home, tribe. She watched him struggle through his limited vocabulary, and something that might have been amusement flickered across her face. So brief he almost missed it, and then she spoke again, this time in halting English. Broken and accented, but understandable. She said 3 things that night, 3 things that would haunt Marcus for days to come. First, she told him her name, Kai. and made him repeat it until he pronounced it correctly, until he showed her the basic respect of getting it right. Second, she told him that he was a fool, not for accepting her from Thornton, though that was certainly foolish, but for thinking he could simply undo such an action by cutting ropes and offering kind words. Third, she told him that where they were going, he would either prove himself worthy of the mercy her people might show him, or he would die in the desert, like so many others who'd come with empty promises and greedy hearts. Marcus asked her why she was letting him follow if she believed he might be killed. Why not just slip away in the night and leave him to his fate? Her answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. She said she wanted to watch, wanted to see what kind of man he truly was when faced with the consequences of his choices, wanted to witness whether he would run when things got difficult, or whether there was something in him worth saving. She was testing him, had been testing him from the moment they left Thornton's, and every step of this journey was an examination Marcus hadn't known he was taking. The days that followed blurred together into a rhythm of walking and riding, of silence and brief exchanges, of Marcus slowly learning that everything he thought he knew about survival in the desert was shallow compared to Kai's deep understanding. She showed him which plants held water in their roots, which insects predicted coming storms, which animal tracks meant danger and which meant opportunity. And with each lesson, Marcus felt his own pride crumbling. He'd thought of himself as a frontiersman, as someone who knew this land. But next to Kai, he was just a child playing at wilderness survival, and somewhere during those long days of following her through terrain that should have killed them both, Marcus stopped thinking of her as the woman he'd accepted as payment. He started thinking of her as his teacher, his guide, and perhaps, if he could prove himself worthy, someday his friend. But first, he had to face her people, had to stand before them and answer for what he'd done, had to explain how he'd treated one of their own as property, as something that could be traded for supplies and ammunition. The thought terrified him more than any gunfight or cattle stampede ever had. Because this time he deserved whatever judgment came his way. And Kai, she walked ahead, leading him toward that judgment with steady steps, never once looking back to see if he was still following, because she already knew he would be. Some choices, once made, cannot be unmade. They can only be faced with whatever courage and integrity a person can muster. Marcus Wade was about to learn that lesson in ways he never imagined. On the seventh day of their journey, everything changed. They'd been climbing gradually into hills that rose like ancient sentinels from the desert floor, the terrain becoming rockier, more difficult, but also more beautiful in its harsh grandeur. Kai had been moving faster now, with increasing purpose, and Marcus sensed they were getting close to wherever she was taking him, close to the moment of reckoning he both dreaded and knew he deserved. Then, as they crested a ridge just before sunset, Kai stopped so suddenly that Marcus's horse nearly walked into her. She stood perfectly still, her body tense, her eyes scanning the valley below, where smoke rose from what must have been dozens of dwellings, where people moved like ants in the distance, where life continued in patterns unchanged by the violence and chaos of the world beyond these hills. This was her home. Marcus realized this was where she'd been heading since the moment she started walking south. And now that they'd arrived, now the real test would begin. But Kai didn't move forward. Instead, she turned to Marcus, and for the first time since they'd met, he saw something vulnerable in her expression, something that looked almost like fear. She spoke in her halting English, telling him what he needed to know before they descended into that valley, telling him the truth she'd withheld until now. She wasn't just any member of the tribe below. She wasn't just a random victim who'd been taken during a raid by drifters. She was the daughter of Thunder Wolf, the chief of the Red Canyon people. Her father was a man of great wisdom and even greater fierceness, a leader who'd kept his people safe through decades of conflict and change. And she was his only child, his heir, The one being taught to lead when his time came to walk with the ancestors, the drifters who'd taken her. They'd ambushed her while she was gathering herbs in the high country, miles from the safety of the village, and by the time anyone discovered she was missing, they'd already sold her to Thornton at that cursed trading post. Her people had been searching for her for nearly 2 months. 2 months of not knowing if she was alive or dead. 2 months of her father growing older with grief and rage. 2 months of prayers and ceremonies and desperate hope. And now Marcus understood the full weight of what he'd done, what he'd accepted. He hadn't just taken possession of some nameless captive. He'd participated, however unknowingly, in the kidnapping of a chief's daughter, in the desecration of a people's most precious treasure. The punishment for such an offense, Kai explained with stark clarity, was usually death, slow and painful death, the kind meant to serve as warning to others who might consider such crimes. But she'd brought him here anyway, had led him directly to the judgment that awaited. And Marcus finally understood why. She was giving him a choice, the same choice he'd given her back at Thornton's, except this time the stakes were reversed. He could turn around, ride away, save himself and live with the guilt and cowardice of running, or he could face her people, face her father, and accept responsibility for his actions no matter what the cost. Marcus dismounted from his horse, his legs shaky from more than just 7 days of hard travel. And he looked at Kai, really looked at her, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. She was strong, yes, but she'd also been terrified during their journey. Not of him, but of what might have happened to her people while she was gone, of whether her father still lived, of whether she'd ever see home again. She was brave, yes, but she'd also been testing him relentlessly because she needed to know if he was someone who could be trusted, someone who might be worth saving from her people's justified wrath. She was a leader's daughter, yes, but she was also just a young woman who'd endured unspeakable trauma and still managed to walk with dignity and purpose toward an uncertain future. Marcus told her then, in words that came from somewhere deeper than pride or fear, that he would go down into that valley with her, would face her father and her people, would tell the complete truth of how he came to have her in his custody, and would accept whatever judgment they deemed appropriate. He told her he was sorry, truly sorry, not just for accepting her as payment, but for every moment he'd treated her as less than fully human. For every second he'd prioritized his own survival over her dignity and freedom. He told her that meeting her, following her through this desert, learning from her, had shown him what real strength looked like. And if he died for his mistakes, at least he'd die knowing he'd finally done something right. Kai listened to his words, and something in her expression softened, just slightly, just enough for Marcus to see that perhaps, just perhaps, she believed him. She told him that her father would ask her opinion, would want to know what she thought should be done with the white man who'd brought her home, and that she would speak truthfully about what she'd witnessed during their journey together. She couldn't promise his safety, couldn't guarantee he'd leave the valley alive. But she could promise that he'd be heard, that his actions during their time together would be weighed against his initial crime. It wasn't much, but it was more mercy than Marcus probably deserved, and he accepted it with gratitude that went beyond words. As the sun set behind them, painting the valley in shades of purple and gold, Kai and Marcus descended together toward the village below. People noticed them coming, voices raised in excitement and alarm, and within minutes it seemed like the entire tribe was emerging from their homes, running toward them, some crying, some shouting, all of them focused on the young woman who'd been returned to them. Kai's father, Thunderwolf, came last, walking slowly, his face a mask of controlled emotion, his eyes fixed on his daughter with an intensity that made Marcus's blood run cold. This was a man who'd thought his child dead, who'd lived with that grief for 2 months, and was now seeing her alive, returned, but accompanied by a stranger who represented everything he had reason to hate. The moment of truth had arrived. and Marcus Wade stood in the center of it, unarmed, vulnerable, and completely at the mercy of people he'd wronged in ways he was only beginning to understand. The story he'd stumbled into through desperation and bad choices was about to reach its climax, and there was no predicting how it would end. Thunderwolf stood before Marcus like a monument carved from stone and will, his weathered face revealing nothing, his eyes examining every detail of the white man who'd brought his daughter home. The entire village had gathered in a circle around them, creating a court of collective witness, and Marcus felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, judging, measuring, deciding whether he deserved to live or die. Kai stood between them, neither fully with her people nor fully separate from Marcus, and her position spoke volumes about the complexity of what had transpired during their journey. Thunderwolf spoke first, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd with the authority of someone used to being heard and obeyed. And though Marcus couldn't understand the Apache words, he felt their power, their controlled rage, their demand for answers. Kai responded in their language, speaking at length, gesturing occasionally toward Marcus, and he could only stand there helplessly, not knowing if she was condemning him or explaining the nuances of how he'd treated her. The conversation between father and daughter continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, and Marcus watched Thunderwolf's expression shift subtly, from pure anger to something more complicated, something that included confusion and perhaps the faintest hint of curiosity. Finally, Kai turned to Marcus and translated what her father needed to know. Thunderwolf wanted to hear directly from Marcus, in his own words, the complete story of how he came to have Thunderwolf's daughter in his possession. And he wanted the truth, because if Marcus lied, if he tried to minimize or excuse what he'd done, the punishment would be immediate and final. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling his heart hammering against his ribs, and began to speak. He told them everything, starting with the flash flood that destroyed his herd, his desperate need for supplies, his arrival at Thornton's trading post with nothing but worthless pride. He told them about Thornton's offer, about the moment he saw Kai bound and broken in that dim corner, about the choice he made that would shame him for the rest of his life. He didn't try to justify it, didn't try to paint himself as a rescuer or savior. He simply admitted that survival had mattered more to him in that moment than doing what was right, and that he'd compromised every value his parents had taught him. He told them about cutting her ropes that first night, about offering her freedom, and about how she'd simply started walking south, leading him on a journey that taught him more than any church sermon or moral lesson ever could. He described watching her navigate the desert with skill that humbled him, learning from her knowledge of the land, seeing her strength despite everything she'd endured. He told them that by the third day, he'd stopped thinking of her as property or burden or anything other than a person who'd been wronged, and that he'd followed her not to control her, but because he needed to understand what he'd become. He explained that she'd taught him about water sources and storm signs and survival techniques, but more importantly, she'd taught him about dignity, about maintaining your humanity even when others tried to strip it away. And he told them, with complete honesty, that he'd come to this valley knowing he might die here, but that facing the consequences of his actions was the only way he could begin to make amends for treating Thunderwolf's daughter as something that could be bought and sold. When Marcus finished speaking, the silence that followed was absolute. Thunderwolf stood motionless, processing everything he'd heard, weighing the white man's words against his daughter's testimony, against the evidence of how she'd been returned, against the customs and laws that governed his people's justice. Then he spoke again, and this time Kai translated for Marcus immediately. Thunderwolf said that in his culture, a man who harmed another man's family owed a debt that could only be repaid through blood or service, and the victim's family decided which form that debt would take. He said that Marcus had indeed committed a grave offense by accepting Kai as payment, by treating a human being as property. even if he claimed not to know her true identity at the time. He said that ignorance didn't erase guilt, that a man was responsible for his choices, regardless of what he knew or didn't know when he made them. But he also said, and his voice softened almost imperceptibly as he said it, that Kai had spoken on Marcus's behalf, had told him about the journey, about how Marcus had immediately freed her and then followed when she chose her own path. She told her father about the water Marcus shared even when his own supplies ran low, about how he'd offered his horse even though she refused, about how he'd never once tried to force her or control her after that first terrible transaction. She'd told him that Marcus had listened when she taught him, had shown respect for her knowledge, had treated her not as property but as someone whose wisdom exceeded his own, and most importantly, she told her father that Marcus had chosen to come here, to face judgment, when he could have easily ridden away and lived with his guilt in private. Thunderwolf said that these things mattered, that they didn't erase what Marcus had done, but they spoke to who he might actually be beneath the mistakes and desperate choices. The chief declared his judgment then, speaking slowly and clearly so Marcus would understand through Kai's translation the full weight of what was being decided. Marcus would not die, would not face the blood punishment that Apache law allowed for such offenses, but neither would he simply walk away, free and unburdened. Instead, Marcus would remain with their people for 1 full year, would work alongside them, learn their ways, serve their community, and prove through sustained action whether the character Kai had witnessed during their journey was genuine or merely fear-driven performance. At the end of that year, Thunderwolf would decide again, would determine if Marcus had earned the right to leave with their blessing, or if further justice was required. It was mercy, but mercy with conditions, mercy that demanded proof, mercy that said trust must be earned through time and consistent behavior rather than granted freely. Marcus accepted without hesitation, bowing his head in acknowledgement of both the judgment and the grace inherent in being given any chance at all. And as the crowd began to disperse, as people returned to their evening routines with the drama resolved for now, Marcus felt something unexpected wash over him. Relief, yes, but also something more profound, gratitude for being given the opportunity to make amends rather than simply being punished. And beneath that, something even deeper, a sense that perhaps this year wouldn't be a burden or hardship, but rather a gift, a chance to become someone better than the desperate man who'd accepted another human being as payment for supplies. Thunderwolf walked away with his daughter, his arm around her shoulders, reunited after months of painful separation, and Marcus stood alone in the gathering darkness of a valley that might become his home, facing a future he never could have imagined just 7 days earlier. The judgment had been rendered, and now came the harder part, living up to it. The first weeks in the valley were the hardest Marcus had ever endured, and he'd endured plenty in his years on the frontier. He was given a small dwelling on the edge of the village, close enough to be watched, but far enough to maintain some separation, and he was assigned to work crews that rotated daily, learning different aspects of how the Red Canyon people lived. Some members of the tribe treated him with cold courtesy, others with open hostility, and a few with cautious curiosity, but none with easy acceptance. He was an outsider, a white man, someone representing a people who'd broken treaties and promises, who'd taken land and resources, who'd treated Apache lives as expendable obstacles to progress. Every morning, Marcus woke before dawn and waited to be told what work he'd do that day. Repairing tools, hauling water, tending crops, processing animal hides. Whatever task they assigned him, he did without complaint or hesitation. He'd made a promise, accepted Thunderwolf's mercy, and he would honor that commitment no matter how difficult. Kai kept her distance during those first weeks, and Marcus understood why. She needed to reintegrate with her people, to heal from her trauma, to resume the life that had been violently interrupted. She didn't owe him anything, especially not her presence or attention, and Marcus respected that boundary, even though he sometimes wished he could ask her questions about customs he didn't understand, or mistakes he'd surely made. The language barrier was enormous. Marcus's handful of Apache words were useless for real communication, and most of the tribe had no interest in speaking English with him. So he learned through observation and gesture, through trial and error, through the embarrassment of constant misunderstanding. But slowly, gradually, things began to shift. An elder named Greyhawk started teaching Marcus basic words and phrases during evening meals, patiently correcting pronunciation, explaining concepts that didn't translate directly, treating the education as seriously as any important task. A young boy named Swift River began following Marcus during work, mimicking his movements, laughing at his mistakes but also showing him better techniques, creating an unlikely friendship across barriers of age and culture. A woman named Morning Star, whose husband had been killed by white settlers years before, surprised everyone by inviting Marcus to eat with her family, saying that holding on to hate was like drinking poison and expecting your enemy to die. These small acts of inclusion, of humanity, of willingness to see Marcus as an individual rather than just a symbol of collective wrongs. They mattered more than he could express. As autumn turned to winter, Marcus began to understand the sophistication of the life Thunderwolf's people had built. Their knowledge of medicine came from centuries of careful observation. Their agricultural practices were adapted perfectly to the harsh climate. Their social structures balanced individual freedom with collective responsibility in ways that put many white settlements to shame. They were not the savages that frontier newspapers described, not the obstacles to civilization that politicians denounced. They were people with rich traditions and deep wisdom, people who'd been living successfully in this land for generations before Europeans arrived with their claims and certainties. Marcus had thought he was being sentenced to a year of hardship among primitives, but instead he was being given an education more valuable than anything he'd received in his entire life before. Winter came hard to the valley, bringing snow and freezing winds that tested everyone's preparations and resolve. And during those long, cold months, Marcus proved himself in ways that finally began to earn genuine respect. When a hunting party became trapped by an early blizzard, Marcus volunteered to join the rescue group, using his knowledge of winter survival to help locate them and bring them home safely. When a fire broke out in one of the storage buildings, Marcus worked alongside everyone else through the night, hauling water, saving supplies, asking no special treatment despite the burns on his hands and arms. When an outbreak of illness swept through the village, Marcus sat vigil with the sick, following Morning Star's instructions for preparing medicines and providing care. Exposing himself to the same risks as everyone else, these weren't calculated acts of performance, weren't strategic moves to win approval. They were simply what Marcus had learned was right, what the people around him were doing, what his growing connection to this community demanded. And somewhere during that winter, something fundamental shifted in how he was seen. People began greeting him by name, including him in conversations, asking his opinion on decisions that affected the community, treating him not as a prisoner serving out a sentence, but as someone who belonged. Spring arrived with explosive beauty, the valley transforming into a landscape of wildflowers and rushing water from snowmelt. And with it came Thunderwolf's announcement that Marcus would begin learning more advanced skills. He would train with the hunters, would study the ceremonies and traditions, would be taught things that were usually reserved for those born into the tribe. And this education was both honor and test. Kai became involved in his teaching then, her distance finally bridged by time and healing. And working with her again reminded Marcus of how far he'd come from that desperate cowboy who'd accepted her as payment. She taught him to track animals by reading signs invisible to untrained eyes, to move through the forest without disturbing the natural patterns, to understand the delicate balance between taking what was needed and preserving what must remain. Their conversations during these lessons ranged beyond hunting techniques, touching on philosophy and values, on different ways of understanding the relationship between humans and the land, on what it meant to live with honor rather than merely survive. Marcus told her about his childhood, about parents who died when he was young, about years of drifting from job to job with no real purpose or direction, about how he'd thought success meant accumulating things rather than cultivating relationships. Kai shared her own struggles. The pressure of being a chief's daughter, the expectations to lead wisely when she sometimes felt inadequate, the trauma of her captivity that still haunted her dreams despite her outward strength. They became friends, genuine friends, built on mutual respect and shared experience, on having witnessed each other's failures and growth, on understanding that people are complicated and capable of both mistakes and redemption. Summer brought celebrations and gatherings, ceremonies that honored the seasons and the ancestors, and Marcus was invited to participate fully, to dance and feast and be part of the community's joyful moments as well as its hardships. Thunderwolf watched all of this with his characteristic reserve, offering no commentary on Marcus's progress, giving no hint of what he might decide when the year ended. But his presence at these celebrations spoke volumes about acceptance. As autumn returned, marking nearly a full cycle of seasons, Marcus realized something profound. He didn't want to leave, didn't want to return to his old life of isolation and purposeless wandering, didn't want to lose the connections he'd built with people who'd become more than friends, who'd become family. This valley, these people, this way of living that prioritized community and balance over individual accumulation and conquest, had given him something he'd been searching for his entire life without knowing it: purpose, belonging, the sense of being part of something larger than himself. The question now was whether Thunderwolf would allow him to stay, whether the year of service would earn him the right to remain, or whether mercy extended only to letting him leave alive. Marcus had changed completely from the man who'd arrived here guilty and desperate, but whether that transformation was enough remained to be seen. The day Thunderwolf called Marcus to his dwelling, exactly 1 year after the judgment had been rendered, Marcus walked with steady steps but uncertain heart. The chief sat in the center of his home, smoke rising from a small fire, his weathered hands working on repairing a ceremonial staff, his eyes reflecting decades of wisdom and careful observation. He gestured for Marcus to sit, and they remained in silence for several long minutes. The quiet itself feeling like a test, like Thunderwolf was reading something in Marcus's presence that words might disturb. Finally, the chief spoke, and though Marcus's Apache had improved dramatically over the year, Kai was present to ensure nothing was misunderstood. Thunderwolf said he'd watched Marcus closely during these 12 months, had observed not just the obvious acts of service and integration, but the smaller moments that revealed true character. He'd noticed how Marcus treated the children, with patience and gentle humor, teaching them English words when asked, but never pushing his culture upon them. He'd seen how Marcus spoke with the elders, with genuine interest and respect, asking questions and listening carefully rather than assuming he already knew better. He'd observed Marcus during conflicts between community members, staying neutral when appropriate, offering perspective when asked, never trying to impose his judgment, but also never shrinking from honest opinion. He'd witnessed Marcus during ceremonies, participating with sincere reverence, honoring traditions he didn't fully understand simply because they mattered to people he'd come to care about. And most importantly, Thunderwolf said, he'd watched how Marcus was with Kai, how their friendship had developed without expectation or demand, how Marcus had supported her healing without trying to claim credit, how he'd learned from her without resentment at being taught by someone he'd once wronged. The chief said these things revealed a man who'd not just performed rehabilitation during his year of service, but who had genuinely transformed, who'd allowed himself to be changed by what he'd learned and experienced. Thunderwolf declared that Marcus had fulfilled his obligation, had proven through sustained action that the character Kai witnessed during their desert journey was real, was foundational, was something that could be built upon. And then the chief offered Marcus something unexpected. He said that Marcus could leave with their blessing, could return to his old life knowing he'd made amends, could carry their goodwill wherever he went next. Or he could stay, could become formally adopted into the tribe, could build his future here among people who'd come to see him as one of their own. But Thunderwolf was clear. This wasn't a decision to be made lightly or quickly. It required Marcus to honestly examine what he wanted, to consider whether he was choosing to stay out of genuine love for this life or merely out of guilt and obligation. He gave Marcus one full cycle of the moon to decide, to sit with the question, to explore his own heart with the same honesty he'd shown during his year of service. Marcus left that meeting both elated and troubled, grateful for the choice, but uncertain how to navigate it. He walked through the valley that had become familiar, past dwellings where he was welcomed, past people who greeted him warmly, past the small fields where he'd worked and learned, and he felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He wanted to stay. That much he knew with certainty. But Thunderwolf was right to question his motivations, to demand he examine whether this choice came from the right place. Over the following weeks, Marcus spent long hours in contemplation, talking with friends who'd become his community, with Greyhawk, who'd taught him the language, with Morning Star, who'd shown him forgiveness, with Swift River, who'd grown from a curious child into a young man during their friendship. And he spent time with Kai, walking the same trails where she'd once taught him to hunt, talking about futures and possibilities, about what it meant to belong somewhere, about whether home was a place you returned to or a place you created. She told him during one of these walks that she would support whatever he decided, that he didn't owe her or anyone else his presence, that the year of service had fulfilled the debt, and now he was free to choose based solely on what would make him happy. She said she valued their friendship, would miss him if he left, but that real friendship meant wanting what was best for the other person, even if it meant separation. Her words, her confidence that he could make this choice without obligation, somehow made the decision clearer than all his weeks of wrestling with guilt and uncertainty. When the moon had completed its cycle, Marcus returned to Thunderwolf with his answer. He wanted to stay, not because he owed anyone anything, not because he was running from something, but because this was where he wanted to build his future. These were the people he wanted to share his life with. This was the way of living that made sense to his soul. He'd come to this valley as a prisoner facing judgment. He'd stayed as someone serving a sentence, but he wanted to remain as a member of the community, contributing not out of obligation, but out of genuine commitment to their collective well-being. Thunderwolf listened to Marcus's words, studied his face, and then smiled. Actually smiled, the first time Marcus had seen such an expression on the usually serious chief's weathered features. He said Marcus had chosen well, had understood what was really being asked, and that the tribe would hold a ceremony to formally welcome him as one of their own. That ceremony, held under a full moon with the entire community gathered, marked a transformation that went far deeper than just changing Marcus's status. It marked the completion of a journey that had begun with shame and desperation, that had traveled through teaching and testing, that had arrived at acceptance and belonging. Marcus Wade, who'd once accepted a human being as payment for supplies, who'd treated dignity as something negotiable, who'd valued survival over integrity, had become someone entirely different, someone who understood that true wealth wasn't measured in cattle or gold, but in relationships and purpose, in being part of something larger than individual accumulation. Someone who knew that mistakes didn't define you forever, but only if you were willing to face their consequences and allow them to teach you. Someone who'd learned that belonging was earned through consistent action, through showing up day after day, through proving that your words matched your behavior over time. Years passed after that ceremony. Years of Marcus living fully integrated into the Red Canyon community, contributing his skills, learning continuously, becoming an elder in his own right who could teach newcomers about their ways. He never married, never had children of his own, but he was uncle to dozens of young people, teacher to many, friend to all who sought his counsel. His relationship with Kai evolved into something profound and enduring, not romantic, but a partnership of mutual respect and deep affection. Two people who'd witnessed each other's darkest moments and greatest growth, who trusted each other completely. When Thunderwolf eventually passed, peacefully in his sleep after a long life of wise leadership, Kai became chief, as had always been intended, and Marcus stood by her side as advisor and friend, helping bridge the gaps between her people and the increasing pressures from white expansion. He used his understanding of both cultures to negotiate, to translate not just words, but intentions and values, to help prevent conflicts that might have escalated without someone who could speak to both sides. The valley remained largely peaceful during those years, protected by a combination of Kai's leadership, the community's unity, and Marcus's ability to help outsiders understand that these were people deserving of respect and autonomy. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when Marcus sat watching the sun set over the valley that had become his home, he thought back to that desperate cowboy who'd stumbled into Thornton's trading post with empty pockets and emptier values. He thought about the choice that had nearly destroyed him, the acceptance of another human being as property, the moral compromise that had haunted him until he faced its full consequences. He thought about Kai's fierce dignity even in captivity, about her willingness to test whether he could change, about her father's wisdom in offering mercy with conditions rather than simple punishment or simple forgiveness. And he felt gratitude, not for the suffering, not for the wrong he'd committed, but for having been given the chance to become someone better, someone worthy of the life he'd been allowed to build. That was the real gift Thunderwolf had offered, not just survival, not just acceptance, but the opportunity to transform, to prove that people can change when given the right circumstances and accountability. Marcus Wade had accepted that gift with both hands, had worked every day to honor it, and in doing so had found something more valuable than any material success could ever provide. He'd found home, not as a place on a map, but as a state of being, as belonging to a community, as contributing to something that would outlast him. And when his own time came to walk with the ancestors, years later, surrounded by people who'd become his family, Marcus died knowing he'd lived well, had made amends for his greatest mistake, had become someone his younger self would barely recognize. The story of the white man who'd been judged and stayed became part of the valley's oral tradition, told to teach children about transformation and forgiveness, about the possibility of redemption even after terrible choices, about the value of giving people chances to prove who they really are. 20 years after Marcus had been formally adopted into the tribe, when his hair had gone silver and his hands showed the accumulated wear of decades of work, a stranger arrived in the valley asking for him. She was young, maybe 19 or 20, with features that showed mixed heritage. White and Apache blended in a face that was striking in its symmetry and intelligence. Her name was Sarah, and she carried a letter written in shaky handwriting. A letter from a man named Brooks, who was dying in a settlement 3 days' ride to the east. Brooks, Marcus learned as he read the faded words, had been the man running that trading post all those years ago. The man Marcus had known as Thornton, who'd offered a human being as payment for supplies. The letter was a confession, written by a man facing his mortality and the weight of a lifetime of sins. A man trying to make some small amends before judgment came. Brooks admitted he'd known Kai was a chief's daughter when he offered her to Marcus, had known she'd been taken during a raid by men he'd hired specifically for that purpose, had known the entire situation was far worse than he'd let on. He'd been trafficking in human beings for years, taking captives from various tribes and selling them to ranchers who wanted labor they didn't have to pay, building wealth through the suffering of others, and justifying it by telling himself they were just savages anyway. But age and illness had brought clarity, had stripped away the justifications, had left him facing the raw truth of what he'd done. And the letter was his attempt to acknowledge that truth before he died. He wanted Marcus to know the full scope of the deception, wanted whoever might read the letter after his death to understand that the guilt Marcus carried for accepting Kai as payment should be shared, that Brooks had manipulated the situation, knowing exactly what he was doing, and he wanted to do something, anything, to make even the smallest amends. Sarah, the young woman who'd brought the letter, was Brooks's granddaughter, raised by him after her mother died, and she'd discovered evidence of his crimes while caring for him in his final illness. She'd been horrified, disgusted, struggling to reconcile the grandfather who'd shown her kindness with the man who'd caused such suffering to others. And she'd insisted he try to make amends, had insisted he tell the truth, even if it came too late to matter. Brooks had told her about Marcus, about the young cowboy who'd accepted his terrible offer, and had asked her to find him, to deliver the letter, to see if there was any way to begin repairing what he'd broken. Marcus read the letter 3 times, sitting in silence while Sarah waited anxiously. While memories of that desperate day flooded back with painful clarity, part of him felt anger, rage at having been manipulated, at having his own desperation used against him, at discovering the situation had been even worse than he'd known. Part of him felt something like relief, knowing that the heavy guilt he'd carried for years was at least partially based on incomplete information, that he'd been a pawn in someone else's calculated cruelty. But mostly, Marcus felt sad for all the lives destroyed by men like Brooks, sad for the suffering caused by treating people as property, sad for a dying man finally facing truths he should have confronted decades earlier. He asked Sarah why Brooks hadn't come himself, why he'd sent his granddaughter to carry his confession. She explained that her grandfather was too weak to travel, bedridden and fading, but also that he was afraid of facing the people he'd wronged, afraid of the judgment he deserved. Choosing the coward's path, even in his final attempt at redemption, Marcus saw the shame in Sarah's face, the burden she carried for her grandfather's sins, the fear that she too might be judged for his crimes. And he recognized that look. He'd worn it himself once, had felt that crushing weight of being associated with terrible actions, had understood the desperation to prove you were different, better, worthy of being seen as an individual rather than an extension of someone else's wrongs. He told Sarah then about his own story, about accepting Kai as payment, about the year of judgment, about the transformation that had come from facing consequences and being given the chance to change. He told her that guilt inherited from others was real but not insurmountable, that she could acknowledge her grandfather's sins without being defined by them, that the measure of a person wasn't where they came from, but what they chose to do with the knowledge they gained. He brought Sarah to meet Kai, now a respected chief with silver threading through her dark hair, a leader who'd guided her people through decades of challenge and change. Kai listened to Brooks's confession, read the letter with an expression that cycled through anger and sadness and something that might have been understanding. And then she looked at Sarah with eyes that had seen too much suffering to delight in adding more. She told Sarah that her grandfather's confession came late, that apologies after a lifetime of harm were hollow compared to the damage done, but that bringing the letter showed courage, showed a willingness to face uncomfortable truths that many people avoided their entire lives. She said that Sarah wasn't responsible for her grandfather's crimes, but that she was responsible for what she did with the knowledge of them, for whether she used that awareness to be better, to actively work against the kind of thinking that allowed such atrocities. Kai asked Sarah what she planned to do now, whether she'd return to care for her dying grandfather or whether she'd seek a different path. Sarah admitted she didn't know, that learning the truth had shattered her understanding of her own history, that she was angry at her grandfather, but also aware that abandoning him in his final days might be its own kind of cruelty. Marcus suggested that Sarah stay in the valley for a while, learn from the community her grandfather had harmed, understand the human cost of his actions, and then make her decision from a place of knowledge rather than confusion. Kai agreed, and Sarah accepted, becoming a temporary member of the community, working alongside people whose relatives might have been victims of her grandfather's trafficking, learning their language and customs, sitting with the discomfort of being both connected to great harm and separate from its execution. The weeks Sarah spent in the valley transformed her, opened her eyes to the sophistication and beauty of the culture her grandfather had dismissed as savage, helped her understand that his actions weren't just business transactions, but attacks on human dignity and cultural survival. When she finally returned to her grandfather's bedside, she went with new understanding, with the ability to tell him truthfully how much harm he'd caused, but also with enough healing to care for him in his final days without hatred consuming her. Brooks died shortly after her return, never having faced his victims directly, never having done the hard work of real amends, but at least having acknowledged the truth in his final weeks. Sarah returned to the valley afterward, not to stay permanently but to visit regularly, to maintain connection with the community, to support their needs when she could, trying to create some small counterbalance to her grandfather's legacy of harm. She became a bridge in her own way, someone who could speak to white settlers about the humanity of the people they too often dismissed, someone who could translate not just words but understanding, someone trying to prevent future harms by changing hearts and minds one conversation at a time. Her story joined Marcus's in the valley's oral tradition, another example of how wrongs could be acknowledged if not fully repaired, how guilt could be channeled into positive action, how the next generation didn't have to repeat the mistakes of those who came before. And Marcus, watching Sarah's journey of discovery and transformation, saw echoes of his own path, recognized the universal truth that people struggling with inherited or personal guilt needed the same things: accountability, understanding, and the opportunity to prove they could be better. The letter from Brooks became a teaching tool, read to young people as they learned about their history, used to illustrate how systems of harm operated, how ordinary people could participate in extraordinary cruelty when they stopped seeing others as fully human. But it also taught hope, because if Marcus and Sarah could transform, could face their connections to terrible actions and choose differently going forward, then perhaps change was always possible. Perhaps no one was beyond redemption if they were willing to do the work. Marcus Wade lived to be 73 years old, decades longer than most frontier cowboys, decades filled with purpose and belonging, decades that proved every day that his choice to stay in the valley had been right. His final years were peaceful, spent mostly teaching the youngest generation, telling stories that carried important lessons, helping with light tasks that kept him connected to community life without overtaxing his aging body. Kai remained his closest friend until the end, their bond deepened by decades of shared experience. By having witnessed each other's complete transformation from those early desperate days in the desert, she would visit him daily during his final months, sitting beside his bed in the dwelling the community had built specifically for his comfort. And they would talk about everything and nothing, about memories and hopes, about regrets and gratitudes. Marcus told her during one of these visits that he'd spent years trying to forgive himself for that initial choice, for accepting her as payment, for treating her dignity as negotiable. He said he'd eventually realized that self-forgiveness wasn't really the point, that what mattered was whether he'd used the guilt to fuel positive change, whether he'd allowed his mistake to teach him and shape him into someone who'd never make such a choice again. Kai listened and then said something that Marcus would carry into his final moments. She said that she'd forgiven him years ago, probably before he'd even forgiven himself, because forgiveness wasn't about excusing what happened, but about refusing to let the harm continue echoing forward forever. She said that Marcus had done the hardest thing any person could do. He'd faced the full weight of his worst choice, accepted judgment, submitted to transformation, and then lived differently every day afterward. She said that was enough. That was redemption. That was how broken things got repaired, even if the scars remained visible. She said she was grateful for everything that had come from their meeting, even the terrible beginning, because it had brought someone into her life who'd become essential, who'd helped her lead her people, who'd shown that change across cultural divides was possible. Marcus wept at her words, tears of relief and release, of finally accepting that the burden he'd carried for decades could be set down, that he'd done the work, paid the debt, become worthy of the life he'd been given. He told her that knowing her had been the greatest gift of his existence, that she'd taught him what strength really meant, that without her testing and teaching and eventual friendship, he'd have remained that shallow, desperate cowboy forever. He thanked her for not killing him that first day, when she easily could have, for leading him to judgment instead of vengeance, for showing mercy even when she had every right to demand blood. He thanked her for the valley, for the community that had welcomed him, for every person who'd given him chances to prove himself, for a life richer than anything he'd imagined possible. Kai held his hand and told him he'd more than earned his place, that the valley was better for his presence, that the stories of his transformation would teach people for generations, that his legacy was love and change, and proof that people could grow beyond their worst moments. Marcus Wade died 2 days later, peacefully, surrounded by friends who'd become family, in a home that had never been about walls and roof, but about belonging and purpose. The entire community mourned him, held ceremonies that honored both his Apache life and the white heritage he'd never fully abandoned, celebrated his journey from guilt to grace, from isolation to connection. They buried him in the valley, in soil he'd worked and tended for decades, marking his resting place with stones that carried symbols from both cultures, recognizing that he'd become something unique, someone who bridged worlds through personal transformation. And Kai, standing at his grave after everyone else had departed, spoke to him one final time. She told him that she'd see him again when her own time came, that she'd look for him among the ancestors, that their friendship would continue beyond this life into whatever came next. She told him that his story would never be forgotten, would be told to children and grandchildren, would teach them about mistakes and redemption, about judgment and mercy, about how lives could intersect in terrible ways and still create beauty. She told him that the scared young woman he'd accepted as payment, the one who'd tested him mercilessly during their desert journey, the one who'd brought him to face consequences, was grateful for every moment of their shared history. She told him that he'd been forgiven, that he'd been loved, that he'd been family, and that was everything that mattered. Years after Marcus's death, after Kai herself had passed and new generations led the Red Canyon people, Travelers would sometimes arrive asking about the legend they'd heard, the story of a white cowboy who'd committed a terrible wrong, who'd been judged and transformed, who'd spent his life making amends and building bridges, who'd proven that redemption was possible through sustained commitment to change. The people would share the full story, would take visitors to Marcus's grave, would talk about how his legacy lived on in their community's openness to others, in their belief that people deserve chances to grow, in their understanding that judgment should include the possibility of transformation. They would say that Marcus Wade's greatest achievement wasn't surviving his sentence or earning acceptance. It was showing that change was possible, that who you were at your worst moment didn't have to define who you became. They would say he'd arrived as a man who'd treated another human being as property, and left as a man who'd dedicated his life to honoring the dignity of every person he encountered. They would say his story was both specific and universal, about one cowboy and one Apache woman, but also about how all people struggle with guilt and growth, with mistakes and amends, with the hard work of becoming better than they were. And they would say that the valley itself was different because of him, that his presence had shaped their community, that his transformation had taught them about mercy and accountability, that his life was proof that the hardest journeys, the ones that begin with shame and desperation, can end with honor and belonging. The story of Marcus Wade and Kai, of judgment and redemption, of a payment that became a partnership, of guilt transformed into grace, lived on as testament to the power of facing consequences, accepting transformation, and choosing every day to be someone worthy of the second chance you've been given. It was a story about the Old West, yes, but more importantly, it was a story about human capacity for change, about resilience and forgiveness, about how the worst moments of our lives can become the foundation for our greatest growth. It was a story that reminded people that mistakes don't have to be final, that judgment can include mercy, that transformation is possible when we're willing to do the difficult work of facing who we've been and committing to who we want to become. And it was a story that began with one terrible choice, accepting another person as payment, and ended with a legacy of love and belonging that outlasted the lives of everyone involved, rippling forward through generations, teaching, inspiring, proving that redemption is real when we have the courage to pursue it. That was the story of Marcus Wade, the cowboy who made a mistake that should have destroyed him, but instead became the catalyst for a life of meaning and purpose. A life that showed the world what's possible when guilt meets accountability, when judgment meets mercy, when shame meets the opportunity to transform. And it all began in that moment of desperate choice. That moment when everything could have gone so differently. That moment that set in motion a journey neither he nor Kai could have predicted. A journey that would teach them both what it means to be human, what it means to forgive, and what it means to find home in the most unexpected places. Thanks for watching this story till the end. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, check out these other amazing Western stories waiting for you next. Subscribe, like, and I'll see you on the next ride.